Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Emily Moyer and this is Strange Mosaic. And earlier this summer, I had the pleasure of being on the One on One podcast. He was one of the people I got to know after I was on Weaving Spiders and sort of opened up a window to a whole new world of people I didn't know before. And I think when I was on his show, he was in like month 1 or 2 of a brand new baby. And he was like super tired. And I wasn't even entirely sure he was all the way with me during the podcast, but the series of emails that followed let me know that not only was he with me, he was listening. And I think that he was actually getting on a level that no one else I've talked to, including ongoing podcast partners, has completely understood what I am saying when I say interdimensional architecture. So here to lay it on thick, Juan on Juan, welcome to Strange Mosaic. How are you?
So I've heard that what happens on Strange Mosaic stays on Strange Mosaic. So I'm ready to get strange. Is that correct?
Let's get strange, dude. Let's get strange. But before we do, I think you might be a new person to most of my audience. I've heard a lot from longtime listeners that they like some of the new people that I have been talking to and met since I was on the Weaving Spiders and whatnot. So I'm pretty sure many of them, unless they're like deep into sort of Florida Tartaria, may not have heard of you. So tell us a little bit about One on One. I don't know if that's like you and your altar, if there's like 2 in 1 there, right? So just like, how did you come to this game? You're a young guy, your dad, I think you got like a normal job too. But you hit it out of the park with some of your research. So how did you end up here?
Well, thank you for having me on, Emily. I really enjoyed our last episode on my show. It was episode 103 and on the interdimensional architecture, because that's something I'm a sci-fi nerd. So anything, I play Dungeons and Dragons, World of Warcraft. So anything magic and anything interdimensional just really makes what I call my esoteric nipples hard. So I came to this. I was born and raised Pentecostal Christian. I was in the church, hardcore. I was going 3-4 times a week. I was playing in the worship group. I traveled around with the band, playing at juvenile centers, at you name it, other churches, doing concerts and all this stuff. And that was my entire life till I was, I don't know, probably 18 or 19, and I'm 28 now. And I started to notice that not everything is as it seems, right? Obviously. But I hadn't seen anything other than that, right? I had been always in that. And I'm not trying to bash religion, because I do feel it has its purpose. It gives people structure and purpose, which is really important for a lot of people. But for me, there was always something off. Not that I don't believe in a higher power. I do believe in a source. What I don't want to subscribe to is the view that's presented, right? That's pushed on people, that this is what it is and this is what you have to follow. Well, I always ask those questions. Well, if those people are going to hell in my reality, then if they're going to hell in my reality, then I'm going to hell in their reality. So how does that even make sense? And there was questions that I couldn't get answers to. And whenever I would question, it'd always be like, for example, the Book of Enoch. Hey, what is all this about? What's up with the canon and the non-canon? Well, you see, the way it works is actually don't read that. Oh, but it's a book that's no, don't pay attention, but it's referenced in the canon. I'm trying to explain to you, right? And they're like, no, just put it to the side. Don't read that. Focus. You need to pray and you need to focus, and God will show you the way. And growing up my entire life, I was fascinated with the, not so much the paranormal, but aliens, Bigfoot. The Bermuda Triangle is really one of the first things that I started to look into when I was in 2nd, 3rd grade.
But the reptilians are your favorite, right? You love the reptilians.
The reptilians. But here's the thing, at 11, 12 years old, I was reading the book Revelation, and my grandma was telling me how they would cut my head off if I didn't believe. In order for you to repent, you need to get your head cut off. I was 11 and 12 years old as a kid. I was reading about this stuff. So I was kind of scarred, right? Traumatized early, where it's like, wait, if I don't believe in this, I'm going to get my head cut off later on. And it got to a point where when I moved out and I was able to make my own decision, I was like, you know what? I don't enjoy going to church. I don't enjoy the people there. People are fake. And this is my experience. I'm not trying to say this is for everybody. A lot of people are really fake. So I just cut that out, and I needed an outlet for my creativity. So I first, I'm big into fishing. I tried fishing videos, but the thing about fishing is you can go out for 12 hours at a time and not catch anything. So it's like, now I don't have a video. I just spent 12 hours. Yeah, I was hanging out, but I don't have content. So then I was like, let me get into podcasting and listening to different shows, Tinfoil Hat, Joe Rogan, all these shows that always pique my interest. But I never heard what I wanted to hear about the deep stuff, right? About the occult, about magic, about the people weren't asking the questions, the hard questions, because people get uncomfortable. And what I told you about in the second hour, I want to get into something that I had to consult somebody to be like, hey, can I get into this? Like, I found this book. It's not electronically published anywhere, and it gets into some really deep stuff. So I had to consult, because I'm not a practicing occultist. I just know about the occult. So this type of information that comes to me, I'm like, should I say that? Because we know what happens when people, I call it flying too close to the sun. Some things end up happening if you start looking down rabbit holes that you're not supposed to be looking down. So in the first year of my podcast, I was, getting my footing and finding my niche. And I think I found it now with just, I don't want to, weird, obscure topics, really, and bringing a new look upon the same subject that everybody else is looking at. Because how many times can you say the same thing over and over again without it getting repetitive? So I want to put a spin on that. I want to talk about something else. And you associated me with Tartaria and Weird Florida. That actually was something that came forth from another researcher. Shout out to homie Romy, who has his own podcast. And he came to Florida. I had never looked at Florida other than the Bermuda Triangle. And he was like, hey, dude, we got to look into these guys. And lo and behold, that's connected to a lot of crazy conspiracies. Not conspiracies, because a lot of it is
real.
Is history. It's real. So that's how it started for me. And I like to really step it up when it comes to the research. And I like to go directly to source material, and I like to bring a new view upon things. And that's what people have really come to know me for, where I bring up just new perspectives of maybe something that we've been talking about and looking at. But then there's subjects, what we're going to get into today, where I've always been fascinated with things of interdimensional or unforeseen or invisible, where it sounds like science fiction, but the truth is stranger than fiction. And I came across a book. I sent it to you. I was like, wait. And I started diving down that wormhole, that rabbit hole. And they don't call me the rabbit hole master for nothing. So here we are. And that's a little bit about my little journey.
All right. So I want to pull on a couple of things there. So your last, I saw your last name before we started. I don't know if you have that put out publicly, so I'm not going to say, but what is your heritage? Because you said you were Pentecostal. I would have guessed Catholic if you said religion, or maybe some other denomination of Christian, but I wouldn't have guessed Pentecostal. So what is your heritage?
I'm Puerto Rican, and my last name, it is public. It's Ayala. And apparently the Ayala family is very prominent in the Philippines. And the reason I found that out was because I called Comcast one time when I needed something was happening with my internet. And I called the guy, and the call center was in the Philippines or somewhere far. And he's like, oh, royal family. I'm on the phone with this guy. I'm like, what are you talking about? It was the Ayala family. They're apparently they're billionaires in the Philippines. And it took a Filipino call center guy to tell me that the last name Ayala is attached. It would make sense though, because the Puerto Ricans, Spaniards, the indigenous people, and the slaves were a mixture, were mutts of that, essentially. So I'm Puerto Rican, I'm Hispanic.
So, okay. Is Pentecostal a common religion in Puerto Rico?
Yeah.
It is. Okay. I'm not super familiar with Puerto Rico. It's interesting that Ayala is a royal Filipino family. I don't know how much looking at all you've done into any of the indigenous population of Philippines or Indonesia in general. But there's some definitely very interesting tribes there, including a tribe of underwater breathers. It's as soon as you said Puerto Rico and Ayala and Philippines, I was like, ooh, I wonder if there's underwater breathers in Puerto Rico too. And it would make a lot of sense based on a lot of the activity that we hear, that goes on around there. And so that might be something for us to sort of explore a little bit as well another time. And I'll let you know about some of the features of the underwater breathers at some point, and we'll see if we can pull on that a little bit. But okay, I just, I don't know. I think most of the people that I have ever met that are Pentecostal, which are probably really few, I did not know that was common in Latin cultures at all. I usually hear, Catholic mostly, and a few other denominations of Christian or whatnot. So that's interesting to know. And then I really liked what you said about, well, first of all, I like that you weren't satisfied with not getting the answers from your parents and your preachers and all of that kind of stuff. I'm endlessly fascinated at how many people in this realm grew up religious. I did not. I'm actually the only person I've met maybe one or two others, in all the people I've interviewed and gotten to know, that was just really raised with no religion, right? Like, I'd say like maybe some leanings towards atheism, right? But not really in any like super organized way. So it's always fascinating to me how I ended up in the pool with all these people who were very, very religious, right? And it's one of these things that like, some of the stuff that religious people believe like always seemed to me like, how the hell does anybody believe that? So the fact that there's like so few people there's a lot of people that were raised religious and then they're not religious anymore, but they didn't move on to like question everything else. Like they're very not conspiracy minded or very not like super open-minded to the other possibilities we could have been lied to about. And then on the flip side, there are people who start questioning things who like make a ridiculous religion of that too, and require a savior and like, all these kinds of things. So it is interesting that you also come from that kind of background. I loved what you said about when you started listening to podcasts, right? You wanted to do some YouTube videos or whatever. And in some ways, you're a perfect fisherman, man. You're on a fishing expedition all the time with what you're doing. So you are making your fishing videos, and you're just catching a different kind of fish. I felt the same way when I got really into podcasts, and I was into some pretty weird podcasts. Like, even though there weren't as many podcasts when I started listening as there are when you probably started, there was all kinds of wacky shit because censorship wasn't an issue in the early days of YouTube and podcasting and whatnot. And I'm a good bit older than you. So I got into some really weird stuff right off the bat. And even in most of the weirdest podcasts or the most underground or whatever, I always felt unsatisfied that they stepped back right before asking the question that was the only one that I was thinking about the whole time, right? And so for me, that's why I got into doing this, because I wanted to ask the question that for some reason everybody else either didn't occur to them or they refused, or I don't know if they were scared. I don't know what it was, right? So that was kind of, my purpose in doing this. And my observation and experience has been that a lot of times when I talk to some of the guests who were being interviewed on those shows that I saw, they've now been on my show. Oftentimes when I ask the question, either they don't know the answer, they're still looking, or that hadn't occurred to them, or they also don't seem to want to answer. So it isn't just that they weren't asked. And that isn't 100% true across the board, but it's common. And for me at this point, and it's always been a feature of what I do that I'll go there, but I'm starting to become less patient with that. And I'm starting to really want to, pin people down and be like, what is the point of what we're all doing if we're not going to do that, right? Yeah. And And to your point about flying too close to the sun, the Kid Icarus, the wax wings, and all of that kind of stuff, right? There is a truth to that. And also, I think for a long time, a lot of people with interest in keeping certain things hidden in secret have relied on the fact that mythology and that story is out there, that if you get too close, right? And so you have a lot of people, just like you have people self-censoring for topics that aren't considered politically correct or might get you kicked off of YouTube. You also have people not going the step farther, the inch deeper, at least not publicly, because of this built up sort of myth, but that has some truth. All myths are based in truth. But I think we're getting to a place that it's like, some of us need to start kicking the doors in anyway, and just, and deciding, okay, like, this is my life. And, like, these are the questions I have. And if I'm not going to ask them, if I'm not going to nail it down, and we're all just going to sit around and wait for like some brave soul to come do it. It's the same complaint we have about politicians or people who have a big following in the media that for some reason won't talk about this topic or that topic. So we can't be like that if we're also going to criticize everyone else for being like that. So I think with, we can be smart and we can be measured in how we decide to do things, but I think it's time to go there. So I'm glad that you're sort of on that team with me. And I also want to just say that I like that you call yourself the Rabbit Hole Master. I noticed that was your moniker on your Zoom when I was on your show. I think we've always referred to Sophia Smallstorm as the reigning queen of the rabbit hole, that like when you've reached the very bottom of the rabbit hole, Sophia will be sitting there with a cup of tea for you because she's kind of carved out all of those spaces, and she doesn't necessarily talk about all of the things she's found publicly. But I'll be happy to let her know that she has competition. I don't know if you've ever spoken with her, but
I have not. No, I have not.
Jewel.
That title was given to me by a Freemason, so that says something. I don't know.
There you go. All right, you're sleeping with the enemy, my friend. All right, so let's get into it, man. You really were moved by some of the things I said about the interdimensional architecture. And to me, like that's where it's at right now, with all the things going on in the world, with what's staring us right in the face. That's the shit that I'm focused on. So I'm glad that you took a liking to that and went in, dug in deeper, and that you are also informing the TikTok realm of such things, because that is a playground that I don't even know the code to get into that that world. So I'm glad you're doing that, but I can't wait to hear what you have. I did look into the Pythagorean Palaces book that you mentioned to me in the emails, and that you made the TikTok video about, and I have shown your TikTok video on a couple of my shows. I couldn't find an affordable copy of the Pythagorean Palaces because as soon as I mentioned it,
because I bought it all. I bought them.
As soon as I mentioned it, my good buddy Jeff always, as soon as I mention a book, he goes out and buys the last affordable copy, and so then I can't ever have the books that I'm looking for. But I did find that there was like a way I can look at it online. I couldn't download it, but I can look at it page by page. I haven't had a chance to do it yet. So I'm glad you're reading it and you're here to tell us about it. So you said you have a presentation. Take it away.
So you said everything beautifully, and I couldn't agree more when it comes to I've interviewed people who are occultists, and even in the comments, people were like, hey, why is this guy so dodgy with his wording? What's up? I go, there's a reason why it's the occult. There's a reason why it's exoteric and esoteric. And I respect that, right? If you are doing something, as long as you don't hurt yourself or others, you can worship Cthulhu for all I care. You can do whatever you want with your body, as long as you don't hurt others or yourself. That's the way I feel about practicing. And we live in this beautiful country where you're able to practice freedom of religion. You're able to practice whatever it is that you want, obviously within those guidelines, to me. And So I've always been fascinated with, in this realm of research, I'm constantly looking for I don't know, I should put it up for the next hit of euphoria, right? The next, not high, but like, oh, wow, this is amazing. Because as soon as you start off with, people always ask me, oh, what book should I read to begin? Well, I always point them in the Manly P. Hall, A Secret Teaching of All Ages. If you want to get just the tip in, you just read that one, and from there it'll trickle down, and you can, each individual section you can look into. It's gotten like that for me, where I did this area of research, I did this area of research, and now I'm starting to see how they start connecting with one another, where they start to bleed into one another. I go, okay, well, oh, I've heard this guy before. Well, that's the guy that has to do with this and that. And that's how I came across Pythagorean palaces. I was doing research on another episode, which we talked about briefly on my show when you were on, about the mirrored realities, how they want to mimic a higher level of existence. And by the way, I hate TikTok. I think it's a cesspool. I think there's a bunch of NPCs on there. And whenever you bring something up that's new, somebody always has to one up you. Oh, I knew that years ago. Oh, did you really? But did you make a video on it? No, probably not, right? So you always have that guy that wants to one up you. I already knew that. What's so mind blowing about that? Okay, whatever. You know what I mean? Like, you always have those people. And then if there's a large fandom on there that will go after you. I've been attacked because I talked about Cthulhu potentially being a jinn. Apparently you can't say that because he's this fictional creature is a god above gods. I'm sorry that I can't speculate on mythology, on the mythos of some guy back then that came up with it in his imagination. Or did he really? Or was it something outside the fabric of reality influencing him, right? So you have these ideas, and when I post that, again, a different view on the same perspective everybody's been looking at, people flip out. But the way I see it is, no publicity is bad publicity. So the people who troll me and they keep commenting, that's fine. It's good for the algorithm. Keep commenting, and I'll keep thumbing it up or replying back something dumb just to, get the engagement going. So yeah, I hate TikTok. And this idea of Pythagorean palaces, I came across it doing this research, and it related to John Dee. And I've studied John Dee in depth as well. And I've been meaning to do an episode on it. I've probably read, I think, 4 biographies on John Dee now, and the Enochian system that he authored. And I have some of that in here too, because that really stepped it up more. And in that paper that I saw, which was a Japanese individual, a Japanese researcher, because I always like to go to the source material. If I'm reading something and I see somebody say something really interesting, I want to know where they got that from. Because if I go to repeat it again, I need to be able to cite my source. So when he says something like where Marsilio Ficino is talking about a Neoplatonic Renaissance philosopher, right? He was at the forefront at the revival of Neoplatonic thought in the Renaissance. When he's talking about how if you adhere to Pythagorean principles, you're able to encapsulate an imaginary building of higher consciousness within an actual building. I go, that is crazy to me. That I'd never even thought about that, but it immediately made me think of the interdimensional architecture. So when I looked it up, I saw it was this really enigmatic author, G.L. Hersey, where I picked up his book. I saw there was only one available, and I paid like $100 for it. So I picked it up, and I couldn't put it down. I was reading it. I know about Pythagoras. I know what he was all about, which I'm going to get into that now. But when you start to see it being again blended into other areas of research, I have another friend who talks about Renaissance architecture and how architecture is essentially, at the end, it's a talisman, right? It's a machine. And they use it. The cathedrals, right? Fulcanelli, the cathedrals were used as talismans, as magical talismans to warp the perceptions of everybody. Because if you think of it to be true, it becomes true. So they were using this technology, and it's linked to Tartary and all that stuff. We want to go down that rabbit hole, but essentially that these buildings were used. But I'm having a hard time understanding the why. I think I have the who, the where, the when, the what, but I'm having a hard time understanding the why, other than for power. And we'll get into it. So I dubbed this math magicians, number forms, and arquitectura imaginales. And that comes from dubbed the Mundus Imaginalis by, have his name here somewhere, but it was, he was Carl Jung's friend, and he dubbed it where it's essentially this realm, the imaginary realm, but it's not, just because it's imaginary doesn't make it unreal, right? And we'll get into that. So some of the greatest minds of antiquity were obsessed, I've noticed, with turning their ideas into Platonic Archimedean solids. And essentially what it is, it's having an idea transcend different levels of existence or reality. And we have Plato with the theory of forms, where he argues that non-physical forms represent the most accurate reality. This world is full of it. It's a reflection of a more divine world. So if you have a horse in this world, it's an imperfect copy of the perfect horse above, right? Above. And Plato also talked about archetypes and all these things, but essentially what I don't like about that, because he came up with the demiurge, right? Plato, is that it demeans this reality. So Pythagoras founded everything that the Gnostics were talking about, which the Gnostics were going off of everything that Plato talked about. So you see this line of it's Pythagoras, Plato, Gnostics, then Christianity, the church. And there's always something focusing on you wanting to ascend, you wanting to go above, you live this life good with a good karma, you do everything you need to do, you pay your tithings, you do everything that you need to do, and maybe we might save you a seat. We might save you a seat if you're a good little boy and you just need to make sure you follow all the rules and everything. Well, that for some people, that rubs them the wrong way. There's this idea of the demiurge and how this is a prison, this is a hollow shell for, you know, the soul and all these things. Well, that comes from Plato, really. And this is from the book that I want to reference in the second hour, where the juice is, when I'm really going to crank it up to 10, because I'm not sure if I should be saying some of that stuff in there, but I don't see why not, because it's a book. So I don't know, right? Like all architectural forms created by the mind and sound, whether physical or psychic, they are founded on the Platonic solids. And I never understood why it is that these people of antiquity, or even today, want to transform their ideas into solids. But I mean, you can say that's manifestation. That's all what magic is all about. And ideas like the cosmic mind or the Greek nous, right, which is this universal mind, were born with pre-Socratic philosophers. This weird guy, Thales of Miletus, which is the father of Western philosophy. And he used geometry, because this is related to sacred geometry and number, which we're going to get into Pythagoreanism. He used geometry to calculate the heights of pyramids and the distances of ships from the shore. And he was actually the first one ever to have a mathematical discovery attributed to him. So the first person in history to be like, okay, this mathematical discovery, which is the Thales theorem, is attributed to this guy. He was the first one. And his pupils consisted of Anaximander, Anaximenes, and of course, Pythagoras. So his school birthed all these other Western philosophy. So we see it go from one guy, and I'm sure there's another guy before him who you can trace the lineage back. And concepts like apeiron manifested. Apeiron is a cosmological theory created by Anaximander, in which he believed the beginning of the ultimate reality is eternal and infinite, or boundless, apeiron. And apeiron is not subjected to the laws of time and is regenerative. So you see these ideas of, I've always said, why are we using ideas of the ancients from a guy from 200, year 200, 300? We're using their ideas today. Pythagoras was alive in the year 500, 600. And we're using his theorems today. I think that's the secret to the immortal alchemist. And that's a whole other thing that I talk about, where these guys are literally, they become an Elias Artista, like this Rosicrucian Messiah that lives on the ascended masters, that they live outside the fabric of reality. And they achieve this through, I believe it's through making an imprint on history. And people talk about, oh, well, I want to live forever in this body. Well, I don't think it works that way. I think it works differently. I think it's more of a metaphysical thing, and their spirit goes on in a way. And I've talked about this in depth on my show. So they wanted to take sophisticated ideas like this universal mind or this higher realm, and they wanted to bottle them up into one place. They wanted to encapsulate them. And I believe that this is achieved through the use of formula. I consider formula the same thing as a magical operation, as a ceremony, because a formula allows you to take incorporeal concepts, so concepts that are in the ether essentially, and you plug them into this formula to get a different outcome. Well, as kids in school, they always told you to plug it into the formula, right? But they never told us, what these number forms, what they mean. If you ever asked your math teacher to explain what this theorem meant, they gave you some generic answer, or sometimes they couldn't even answer you. And that goes back to my whole thing of me questioning, right? Like, what is this for? When am I going to use this, teacher? Well, you might not ever use it. Why are you teaching me if I'm never going to use it? But I find it weird that in the Matrix, the characters plug themselves into the Matrix, right? And we'll talk about that later. And
oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Right. They plug themselves in, right? And what is the Matrix? It's number code. And we'll get into that. There's a lot of things that again, when I was putting this together, and mind you, this is not done, right? This is research that I'm going to keep adding to as time goes on. And this is how I got to this point, by doing all the research I've done. And I felt like I was pulling at random things, compiling this document that I have. I'm just, what does this have to do with? But then I would find something that would put them together. So it may seem crazy at first, but trust me, I think I have something solid. I'm not sure, but right, let's take a whack at it.
People like crazy either way. So if you have something, whether you're just making up a story, if it's entertaining, they love it. So
I want to focus on, obviously, these ideas being applied to architecture in order to form a different dimension, in order to either open up a portal or what it is. I'm not 100% sure. And I dubbed this arquitectura imaginalis, so imaginal architecture. And
hold on a second. You said you had 3 sections. Was that complete with the first section and you're moving to the next, or where
I'm on the introduction right now. I'll tell you when.
Perfect. Okay, cool. All right. So tell me when we at the end of each section so I can offer my comments then. Okay. Very good.
I'm still on the introduction.
Perfect.
It's juicy. I'm telling you, this is crazy stuff that I don't fully understand. I'll be 100% honest with you, because I was really bad at math in school, but here it is.
All right.
The Cartesian coordinate system always intrigued me. Its origins, René Descartes, which a very interesting person in history, right, with Cartesian philosophy, but the Cartesian coordinate system, which I remember reading a book about it coming to him in a dream. But when I went to go find that in order to source it in here, the book that it changed. It's allegedly he was laying in bed looking up at a fly on his ceiling, and he wanted to be able to identify where it was according to, so you get the X and the Y. And I'm familiar with the Cartesian coordinate system because I have a background in electronics engineering with a specialization in robotics, and I have done CAD and CAM. So I've programmed robots essentially to follow a coordinate system to make things. So I'm a little familiar with this concept, but it essentially served as a bridge between Euclidean geometry and algebra. And if you look at the etymology of algebra, it's very weird. It's like it's bone. It's putting. I forgot. I have it pulled up here somewhere, but essentially it's like putting together bone. And algebra, right? You have alchemy, which is sacred chemistry. Let me look it up here. So I have it here. Algebra, from medieval Latin algebra, from it's Arabic. And where was it? Anyways, it's somewhere in here. Reunion of broken parts. Oh, so I got it wrong. Anyways, yeah, reunion of broken parts, algebra. Now, and it comes from Arabic. And John D calls it algebra and al-makabel. Interesting. Didn't read that part. But this weird concept, you have this grid, and it revolutionized mathematics. It was at the forefront. And it is most commonly used in computer graphics, computer-aided design, geometry-related data processing. And I consider it a sort of talisman or a talisman or a mandala, because again, it brings these incorporeal ideas into fruition. So if you're able to connect the dots literally within this system, because you add an axis, and these are different levels of reality. You know, when you add that third axis, the Z axis, you get the 3D, which is what's used in essentially modeling and everything. So it brings these incorporeal concepts into fruition. And the ritual is halfway done when it gets to that point. So the process goes like this: from the ether to the mind to verbal expression to a medium, so paper or a program or a small model, which architects would build small models for a reason, to the actual manifestation or the building in the case of architecture. So these guys back then would boast about they were demiurges with these buildings. They were the demiurge of this building. So they would have meetings with royalty and boast about, oh, I came up with this crazy design. Here it is. So it came from the ether and entered their mind. Verbal expression, they're talking about it to the royalty before they actually draw it up, make the little model, show it to the king or the queen or whoever it may be, and then they build the actual building itself. Architecture is divination, because they need to be able to, in 100 years from now, they need to be able to tell if that foundation is going to hold that building. So everything that the architect is doing, back then architects were magicians. They were practicing divination. So again, very interesting concept. And that concept of an architect being a magician is an actual field of study. There are people who actually have written books about this. I actually have an interview tomorrow with one of them, with a professor who wrote a book, Architect as Magician. So hopefully I'll see how many people buy that book from your audience, Architect as Magician.
Well, your interview with him will be before this goes out. So I don't know if you want to buy the book. If you don't have it yet, buy it before this goes out. Otherwise, Jeff will snag it, and then you won't be able to get it.
So I relate this. So going back to the occult, because I think the occult is related to a lot of things that we talk about, whether we like it or not. But I relate this to the Golden Dawn's interpretation of Enochian magic. Mind you, I told you that I studied John Dee. I know about John Dee. I've read like 4 of his biographies. So it clicked in my mind. Oh, wait, this is related to so-and-so. And John Dee was a very peculiar guy. He's a very interesting. But I relate to the Enochian interpretation because they took his system. Crowley did something with it as well, where certain furniture and tablets are used in a ceremonial setting in order to invoke Enochian entities. And these entities are given a physical medium in order to manifest. So I don't know if you've ever seen an Enochian tablet. It's got like tourniqueted pyramids in it, right? So they're raised, and that's the 3D. That's the manifestation aspect of it, where they need to, don't give them anything bigger, because they talk about all these entities are super strong. Don't give them anything bigger than that. Just give them something just enough to where they're able to, just a tip, where they're just able to show you a fraction of what they're able to do. Again, I'm not a practicing occultist. This is from accounts that I've read or from people who have told me about it. Regardless of all this stuff that I talked about, I believe the modern day educational system is a Rockefeller byproduct. It's a Frankenstein, right, of a bunch of people put together, and I put in here, in a quasi Promethean way. Instead of illuminating us with knowledge, they seek to suppress it from us. So all the stuff that I talked about of why they don't explain numbers to you, why they don't explain, oh, this is what it means, is because they're trying to suppress these ideas from us. They want it to be esoteric. They don't want it to be exoteric. And this is how we get into how you were mentioning earlier about secret societies and people withholding and gatekeeping information. Maybe some people are definitely doing it intentionally. Some people maybe not. Who knows? But I do think that there is a strategic plan to suppress it from people actually learning about it. And Professor, here you go, Rockefeller. So they're trying to suppress it from us. They've hijacked this information, and the elites understand that all is number, just as Pythagoras stated. And Professor Hersey, which is what really got me into all this, to the Pythagoreans, who were essentially number magicians, numbers were not only quantities, but qualities as well. They had fixed or predictable geometric, psychological, moral, and even personal natures. And I've done an entire breakdown on Pythagorean number symbolism. It's on my Patreon or my Rockfin, where I go from 1 to 10 and above, where I talk about what each and every single number, what it means. And that's a 2-hour presentation. So you can go over there and watch that. Because again, that's why when I was trying to put this together, I wanted to put it together where it wasn't too convoluted, because the entire number symbolism is a 2-hour podcast on its own. That was me by myself talking. So imagine with conversation, like, oh, this means number 1 means this, 2, 3, etc. And it's all related to sacred geometry. And essentially buildings are algorithms incarnated. And there's a reason why you see, it feels like in art, we're going backwards in time. And you see it with the evolution of architecture. Back then, we were able to, these beautiful buildings, to them, they were algorithms incarnated. You know, each and every single measurement of that building was there for a reason. And you see the brutalism movement,
right?
18th, 19th century, where it's used to suppress, right? In order, I feel, again, like a Plato, a Republic, where he was talking about taking away certain musical notes, certain musical instruments, certain frequencies, so they wouldn't speak to the soul on a deeper level, so people would be more susceptible to breaking out of the system, breaking out of the matrix, right? And they're dumbed down, go to work every single day. There's a reason our houses are cookie cutter. Vitruvius talked about how every single space was meant for a certain reason, and energies flow, and feng shui is a real thing, right? The way that your layout and your setup is set. But now we're being attacked from all sides. We have the 5G, the Wi-Fi, all these signals coming at us and bombarding us constantly 24 hours a day. Plus the layout of our homes essentially could be laid out wrong according to Vitruvian principles, which guess who inspired Vitruvius? Pythagoras. So it goes back always to these same guys for some reason. And Hersey maintains the distribution of elements in a building, such as columns, doors, and windows, and their proportional relationships were infused with meanings that we cannot recapture until we examine the mathematical context within which the buildings were designed. And just how a sympathetic magician is able to cause effect from a distance, an architect becomes a demiurge. The buildings acting as their homunculus, as their homunculi, through the law of contagion and correspondence, they're able to manipulate inhabitants' realities, warp their perceptions real time. And Pythagorean geometry not only had an intellectual and aesthetic role, but it also had a spiritual and magical function. And that's the end of the introduction.
All right. Awesome. Okay. So let me just tell you a couple of things that popped just on your after the introduction, just out of curiosity. Have you ever done mushrooms?
Yes, I have.
Okay. One time. Okay. So I don't know.
Baphomet.
Huh?
I saw Baphomet and never again.
Okay. So I don't see stuff like that when I do mushrooms. So my experience in the mushroom realm, and this goes to what you were saying about you didn't know why they felt like they needed to capture ideas in geometric shapes or geometric symbols or forms. So the first couple of years I took psychedelics, I was not closing my eyes. I was, taking them at raves, and I was a break dancer and a popper. And I was like, oh, it makes my body feel weird. I can move like a robot. I can move like whatever kind of thing. I noticed that like my psychology and the things I thought about were interesting, but there was not a visual attached to them. And then some point, after 2005, sometimes after 2005, I started closing my eyes when I was dancing. And when I would be, sometimes I'd be sober, but it was sort of like that started happening after I'd had enough of those experiences on mushrooms or whatnot. But I would close my eyes when I was dancing, and I was treated to the just incredible visual shows that I have never seen anything in the outer world match up to. And they started really simple. And then they got, as time went on, they got more and more complex. To this very day, they're increasing in complexity. But in the very beginning, it was just simple sacred geometry shapes and simple mandalas. And then it became more and more till now, the things that I see are far more intricate than the craziest Alex Gray or any of those other sort of psychedelic artists, you know, sort of entheogenic artists. Like literally, some of the stuff I see in that space is the most fantastic architecture that looks like something far beyond like Angkor Wat or anything that these old things were. It's that with extra dimensions of like color and space, and everything is like, have you ever looked at a lot of like fractals or Mandelbrot sets or any of those like extreme zoom in fractals where it's just everything just wow, like you think you couldn't get to any more definition than that, but you do, like that. But it's always like each trip will be sort of at least one themed kind of building, one themed kind of room or building that I'm sort of exploring. And there's a theme to the things that I'm thinking about, the ideas that are in my mind. And what it feels like is that, and I don't know how the mushrooms are involved in this, other than I think mushrooms have an element of like something having to do with speakers or sound. Because what I have noticed is when I listen to music on mushrooms, it becomes much crisper and much more defined, almost as if it's acting to tune the music perfectly or something. And each of those sounds seem to open up some like other layer of things. So it seems like what gets constructed in the early first hour or two of the trip is a church or a palace for me to explore a certain idea inside of, right? And so I do mushrooms sometimes without music. A lot of times I do them with music, but even when I do them without music, somewhere off in the distance, I don't know if it's inside my ears or my head, or I'm tuning into something elsewhere, like I'm hearing a rhythm. And that rhythm seems to be, that sound seems to be creating the light and the color spectrum and the geometry for that all this is being constructed of, right? And then there's all these eyes there. And there's all kinds of like everyday items that when I look closely at any of these things that look fantastic, I'm like, oh, wow, that's like made up of something that's like an everyday item, but it looks like something I've never seen before, right? And so the idea that a shape associated with the number would compel somebody to think about a certain thing, and then you layer those on top of each other to create more complex ideas or arguments or points of view or whatever. And that you want to construct a space big enough for a person to examine the contents of their mind related to those ideas in that space. And then once you've been there and had that experience, that you want to then, like, the amazing thing is if you can then bring that into reality so others can have that opportunity, right? So to me, that makes that makes perfect sense what you said. The reason that they need to get it into a geometric shape is because that is the most, I think, efficient way to pass complex information across dimension, whether that dimension be from one mind to the next or from the mind to the physical world or whatnot, right? So that, and then you said, you said something about numbers as characters in formulas, right? If you notice in like Stranger Things, the psychic MK Ultra kids are not given names, they're numbered, right? And so, you know, and it seems like number one does this, number two does that thing, 3, 4, 5, we put them together, boom, we have this, right? So when you were talking about plugging into the matrix, if you watched Fringe, Peter had to plug into the machine, Peter had to be with Olivia, right? So I think it's true that people can inhabit some of the ideas that, or people can be the carriers of the geometric or the numeric
Archetypes.
Information. Yes, archetypes, architects, but yeah, perfect. Okay. And then you said putting together bone. Algebra means putting together bone or reunion of the broken parts, right?
I don't know where I got the bone from, but it was a reunion of broken parts. This is the etymology of algebra. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, actually, I was right. The same word was used in English in the 15th to 16th century to mean bone setting as a medieval Latin algebra usage picked up probably Arab medical men. So I was right. So yeah, bone, interesting, right? Bone setting,
That makes
algebra.
that makes sense to me for a couple of reasons, right? So I'm pretty sure that like bones were something used in divination in a lot of ancient arts, particularly in like Asia and things like that, right? There's also obviously the one thing that none of us can argue with that is a plus of modern medicine, where there's so many minuses, is things like surgery and being able to deal with broken bones and putting them back together and whatnot. There's also, and this just came up in an interesting personal way the other day, and I knew about this before, but I'm just thinking about it now. There's a kind of Japanese pottery art that breaks it and then puts it back together, right? Like the art is, you make the thing, you break it, and then you put it back together with this like gold stuff. And it's more beautiful than it was before it was broken. And I think that some of that stuff is made of porcelain, but I think maybe in its original way, some of it was made of bone. You have bone keepers, you have people who fashion all kinds of little figures out of bone. So I think that makes sense, right? Like this obsession with taking things apart and putting them back together. We all know that that's something that like someone who is a little cuckoo, but maybe on the border of genius likes to do, is take it apart, put it back together and all that kind of stuff, right? Architects as magicians, that's where all my stuff is leading me, that like the architecture is, and we should know this because like Freemasons build shit, but somehow we think that Freemasons are different than architects. Like, I don't know where that got so confusing for us. I definitely think so. I think that we are being right now initiated, inducted into a magical realm, and the architects are the creator of the show that we are all participating in, right? You talked about Enochian, the Enochian magic and whatnot. How much have you looked into Enochian chess?
Actually, I didn't know about that until I started looking into this because I wanted to confirm some information. And I saw that the founders actually made Enochian chess. And one of the founders, McGregor, Matt Gregor, I think is his name, would play with a spirit. Did you hear about that? He would, whenever he would go for his partner, because you play with a partner, he would cover his eyes, turn, take the piece, and he would put it down. But I didn't know that they invented Enochian chess. I did come across that when I was doing my research. Yes.
Okay, so I don't know a ton about it. It's come up a couple of times in shows with Michael and I, but it came up. We were looking very closely at the sort of the why now of the what was that chess TV show that came out last year?
Queen's Gambit.
Queen's Gambit, right? Like, we really did a couple of very deep dives on that, and it had some interesting things that it connects to. But we started to look at Enochian chess, and Enochian chess is the type of chess where you take the game and the characters off of the board and out into the real world, right? It's not contained to the Game board.
of Thrones.
Correct, right? So you take it off, and I think that was, and you use the things that you learn about chess out in the real world, right? And it's very, that's what she was doing with like the projection of the chessboard onto the ceiling, and then this examination of her life and how good she was in the game, but how out of control she was in real life, and how she had to learn how to be more chess-like in the way she behaved in the outer world and whatnot. It's also obvious that the Masonic floor is the chessboard that extends in every way. Like if you watched Twin Peaks, and the way when they were in the red velvet room or the dark lodge or the white lodge, like the floor would separate into different levels. There was like the black and the white, right? Like this is kind of like, it's like when something breaks outside of the box that you previously thought it was contained to and begins moving in a way that you don't expect, right? And you can get into like the extended forms of Sudoku with this. You can look at certain forms of like popping, like the dance style. You can look at voguing and king tuts and whatever. And these are other methods of displaying the same idea. And then to the brutalist thing, because I've looked at brutalism a lot, and I think so obviously we had all these fantastic old world buildings, right? That were magical looking, and then we moved into this like brutalist stuff. And I think that I have a different take on brutalism, right? Like, I think, yes, to the average person, exoterically, it was a suppressive architecture. But to those in the know, it was actually the perfect scaffolding for a Pythagorean palace if you understood how to project imagination onto that structure. I've looked at some of that stuff in Cuba, in the Soviet Union and whatnot. And I'm like, yes, you're looking at it and it's like kind of ugly. But if you can imagine this rises up here, it's like looking at a transformer or something like that, right? So I think that was a kind of architecture that separated the exoteric and the esoteric. And it was one experience for the people suppressed by it and another experience for the people who knew what to do with it, right? And then the last thing I wanted to say about buildings as algorithms. Yeah, right. Like for sure. And we're starting to see a form of architecture that is definitely with a function besides just living in it or having offices in there. We're looking at buildings that are also musical instruments, buildings that are pieces of technology, buildings that are transformative, buildings that exist in sort of multiple layers or realms. The algorithm is high magic, right? Like being able to create an algorithm that is an elegant string. They're always wanting to create an elegant string that is fairly simple, but create something super complex. And this was like, I have a cousin who I don't think I ever met, but if I did, it was when I was a baby, who is a famous mid-century modern architect who visits me when I'm having mushroom trips sometimes and explains to me my birthright because I am related to him. And it has to do with all of this kind of stuff, right? And it's much about providing spaces that allow the individual to use their imagination to like meet the structure. Imagination meets structure and becomes whatever you can make of it. And it's almost like people who can do this, it's kind of like having a dance battle or an art battle where it's like, well, check this out. Like, this is what you did. This is what I do or whatever with this, right? So, okay. So that's my response to your opening statements. Go where you like. And this is either going to be a super long show or we may have to quickly come back for a part 2. Go ahead.
I was worried about that because I said, if there's anybody, when I was putting all this together, I said, this sounds really crazy. I'm not sure if anybody's going to be able to keep up, but if I had to pick a better person to do it this way, I think it was you, because you understand these really weird concepts and are able to make something of it. Because I honestly didn't think I was putting anything together coherent until the very end. But you touched on a lot of things that we could get into. But number one is, I had this in the presentation, but I took it out because I went on a limb and said that the Cartesian coordinate system is almost sort of like a Masonic tracing board. And I had it on there, and I took it out because I don't know enough about the Masonic tracing board other than what the exoteric purpose is, right? Who knows what goes on behind closed doors? But I said it's almost like a Masonic tracing board. This idea of things getting out of control, that's Frankenstein, right? Where they put all these crazy parts together and you don't know how it's going to react, and it just goes on a rampage, like the golem, right? The golem goes on a rampage, and they don't know how to stop it. It's bigger and bigger and bigger. And the transformer stuff, which I'll bring up later because it has to do with a lot of this. And one of the one of the magicians who was an architect was Daedalus, the labyrinth, in order to entrap the Minotaur. He was a magician that made the labyrinth in order to entrap the Minotaur, and the Minotaur is symbolic for a lot of things. It could be the bestiality of man, or it can mean a number of things. But Daedalus, and I'll bring up some other stuff later in regards to that because that's really interesting. And part of magic is having a system where you're able to reproduce results. That's science. That is, I believe that quantum physics and all these things is essentially magic. They just have to put quantum entanglement. Oh, okay. And quantum tunneling. Yeah, it's physics. Yeah, it's magic, right? At the end of the day. And there was this really funny thing you said about displaying what I could do in a dance battle, right? Oh, I can, I can do all these things and I look crazy. Well, they were doing that back then with buildings. They were having battles with their buildings. And if you had 12 arcs on yours, well, I wanted 24 arcs on mine. I want double the arcs that you have. If you had 13 pillars, well, I want 26 pillars. And they were going back and forth, literally having a crunk battle with their buildings. And they were flexing to each other. And let's get into the rest of it, because this plays a lot. Again, we can take this a whole number of different ways. And I'm happy I'm here doing this with you, because you're able to take it where we want to go.
Real quick, what you said about the Masonic tracing board and the Cartesian coordinates. So I'm not saying that this is exactly what they do, but I am sure that it's something like this. And I think this is part of what explains the different groups, like, or secret societies, right? Because they have some things in common, and then there's some differences. I think it has to do with what they make each coordinate, right? So I need to do some more understanding of how the Z coordinate comes into this. But I've talked about this a little bit, like with Lindsay Sharman once and whatnot, that like, I think some of the groups, right, use, let's just say, let's play with X and Y for now, and we'll leave Z, okay? So like, let's say X is space and Y is time, right? So some of the groups may use space as X or whatever, and time is Y, right? And the way that they arrange time is around space. Like they use space as their anchor, and they arrange timelines around physical locations. And some other group may do it the other way, right? They use time as their anchor, and then they array their dimensions around that way. And then you bring in the Z, and you start to get into a more three-dimensional kind of thing. And that's the difference between what, I'm not saying that this is exactly how it is, but like maybe the Knights Templar and the Scottish Rite Freeman, whatever it is, right? There's different groups within, and then you have like, Jason Society and blah, blah, blah. You have all these different groups. And I think they just use a slightly different arrangement. They give a different, they give a different property to the coordinate, right? Or the coordinate to the property kind of thing. And then they're able to hide these pocket dimensions or these realities right here. There's no far away place. Everything's here. It's just folded in a way that if you can figure out the geometry, kind of like origami, like if you know how you make a bird out of a square piece of paper, you can sort of mathematics your way into this sort of other realm. And it has a lot to do with perspective and angle and sort of like certain locations. Okay, I'm going to shut up. Go ahead.
So then the next section here, the first section of 3, the number magi.
Okay.
And we have here 2 quotes. Beatitude is the knowledge of the perfection of the numbers of the soul. Pythagoras in all his number. And that's a Pythagorean saying. I don't know if Pythagoras himself said it. And let's keep in mind, I'll say it here. I'll say it in the presentation, but we have many secret societies that have numerical numbers that can be reinterpreted as letters, vice versa. Well, some occult circles actually worshipped the numbers. And Pythagoras, associated with the famous Pythagorean theorem, and it states that in a right triangle, the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the other 2 sides. And Pythagoras was an Ionian Greek philosopher, a mathematician, and founder of the religious movement called Pythagoreanism. And I've studied the Pythagoreans in depth as well. Very interesting. The name Pythagoras derives from the ancient Greek name Pythagoras. The name means the one who persuades the square. Pythagoras also said that it wasn't even his true name, that within his name, it contains numerical and letter powers. So we're getting into the magical aspect of things. He literally put it in his name, which who does that? Frater 210, Frater Topaz or whatever, Frater da da da. secret societies do that. They align the B666 Crowley. There's a reason why he would name himself certain things, so they would align numerically to certain numbers, because it all goes back to all his number. That's why the matrix and all these things make a lot of sense. And I believe that Pythagoras, by saying all his number, he was insinuating that we were in a simulation, and by us being in a simulation, all being number, because it's binary code, then that would hint at a creator or a divine architect, or a programmer. And that's where we get the watchers from. The watchers are these entities that are watching the divine alchemist or the divine architect at work, forming reality, programming reality, doing whatever needs to be done. That's where the term watchers, I believe, comes from.
That's where I think that's what all the eyes, when you're tripping, and that's why it's in the Alex Gray stuff. Everything has eyes in it, is made up of eyes, and it's the creator, the watcher, or the originator of that idea from which you are experiencing this amazing imaginal palace or whatever, watching over either their creation or watching to see what your response to their or the collaboration between you and them's creation is, right? To see that spark of awareness, right? Like to see if you see in me what I see in you, kind of thing, right? Yeah.
And keep the eyes thing in mind, because I'll share a really in-depth synchronicity with you later on the second hour.
Okay.
That goes pretty crazy. So that wasn't his real name. He had numerical and letter powers in Pythagoras. And we have to keep in mind that most of the information written down of Pythagoras was written centuries after he lived. So we have very little reliable information on Pythagoras. He could have not even existed for all we know, just like a lot of other historical figures of antiquity. And the story of Pythagoras, his origin story, is very similar to that of Jesus Christ. And Pythagoras was said to founded the Essenians, and Jesus was said to have studied there, the Essenes. So again, technically, Pythagoras would be JC's daddy. So that's the way I put it. But Pythagoras influenced philosophies of Plato, Aristotle, and through them Western philosophy as a whole. They say that the word philosopher is attributed to Pythagoras, because back then you had sages. Sages know the knowledge already. Philosophers are seeking that knowledge. So that comes from Pythagoras, allegedly. Pythagoras used number symbols as hieroglyphic symbols to represent universal law. So they represented certain archetypes, the monad, the duad, the triad, the decad, all these things, the tetrad. That's all different archetypes for the Pythagoreans. And it is not known if he was involved in what we consider numerology today, since it came after his death, but you can be the judge of that. The association between letters and numbers is possible in various different languages, and cultures have used that as well. Therefore, numerology can't be necessarily related to Pythagorean symbolism of number, but you can kind of see where one sprouted the other there. Yep. Pythagoras was known to be able, you mentioned divination earlier with bones. Pythagoras was known to be able to predict the future because he practiced divination, but there was also stories of him being able to communicate with animals. You couldn't eat beans, right? The Pythagoreans couldn't eat beans. It was really weird, right? So
smart.
there are supposed accounts of him practicing arithmancy or divination by numbers, although it is not proven. But we can say for a fact that the Greeks did actually practice divination with other things. They used the flight of birds, the gathering of clouds, the changing of winds, and the entrails of sacrificed animals. So they were practicing divination with other things. We don't have any written accounts of Pythagoras actually using number to divinate, but use your imagination. He probably was, right? He was known as this sage who was omnipresent, omnipresence, where he was in two places at once. He had godlike powers. He could, there's the same story of when Jesus counted the fish in the net. There's the same story like that with Pythagoras. Pythagoras' mom was a virgin. Mary was also a virgin. So you see he was predicted by an oracle, the Pythia, the Oracle of Delphi. Apparently she was one of the ones that predicted that Pythagoras was going to be this great influencer, right? So again, you see these parallels, it's kind of weird, but who knows? What distinguished the Pythagoreans was their method for purifying the mind. They didn't achieve it by meditating. They achieved it by studying mathematics and science. The ultimate union with the divine was said to follow from an understanding of the order of the universe, and the key to understanding the universe was to understand mathematics. And maybe this is why I don't understand this, because I sucked at math. So maybe that's why I don't understand the order of the universe. The study of geometry, music, astronomy was considered essential to a rational understanding of God, man, or nature. No one could accompany Pythagoras as a disciple who was not well versed in these sciences. A lot of people came to join the cult. It was a cult, but they were tested on the subjects, and if they didn't pass, they were dismissed. And Iamblichus, in his Life of Pythagoras, and Iamblichus is credited with writing the most of Pythagoras. He writes in regards to the Pythagorean initiation, Pythagoras never received as students those who came to him without first testing and examining them judiciously. To begin with, he inquired about their relation to their parents and relatives. Next, he surveyed their laughter, speech, or silence, and whether they were unseasonable. Further, he inquired as to their diseases, their associates, their conversations, how they employed their leisure, and what were their objects of joy or grief. He observed their form, their gait, and their whole motions of their body. And he also considered their bodily constitution visible indications of the soul. So he thought by looking at somebody, observing them, he could tell what their soul was like. So he was literally watching people walk and laugh. Could you imagine sitting in front of Pythagoras and like, all right, laugh for me. And you're just like, ha, 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 ha. You know, you're trying to like, the hell does this guy want? He's like trying to figure me out. So very weird. Just this guy was off. The Pythagoreans related numbers with different archetypes or monadic forms, and they also related numbers with power. Pythagoreans said things exist by imitation of numbers. So we have a different view of Plato's theory of forms, where he said it was, well, it's a form. Well, what is that form? And it goes back to what we were talking about. All right, let's make it into this solid that I can understand. You know, the 5 Platonic solids. Well, let's make it this one, and this one. So to the Pythagoreans, numbers were an enigma that was to be used in the exploration of wisdom. And I have a couple of quotes here by Johannes Kepler and Harmonices Mundi. And Kepler, Pythagoras talked about the music of the spheres. And Kepler took that, and he's the one accredited with the planets having an elliptical circle. He took that to a literal sense. He said, okay, well, there's something here that needs to be understood. So he literally took the frequencies of every planet and transcribed a song, a musical note, because Pythagoras was also accredited with ratios. And he made a song about it, Johannes Kepler. And when somebody played it for him, it sounded horrible. So he was like, you know what? I'm going to ditch that idea. But he states, the Christians know that the mathematical principles according to which the corporeal world was to be created as co-eternal with God held that reality was mathematical in its nature. And is coming again from a time where religion was the main thing, right? Everything revolved around religion. If you were outside of that, you were considered a pagan and you were burned at the stake, literally. The Christian position that emerged at the beginning of the Renaissance, according to Kepler, maintains that humans are searching for the definition of invisible, immeasurable things. So we get to this, what you were talking about, the mushroom realm, where you're seeing all these colors. I can't describe what I'm seeing in the DMT realm, but I can try and draw a picture. So the invisible, the immeasurable, which is essentially God. If this position were true, it would acknowledge that religion, technology, science, and art share the idea that mathematical forms are an acceptable and correct method of representing the truth of the primary explanation for immeasurable things. So with that said, religion acknowledges, this position would acknowledge that all these things that I listed are the correct forms in order to encapsulate that. So this is why it goes from math into architecture, because you have theories and theorems and all these things in order to encapsulate that invisible, immeasurable thing. Architectural theorist Dalibor Vesely stated, the belief shared by artists and scientists during the critical period of transition was that the true order of reality was mathematical, and that the mathematical forms were therefore the most adequate representation of the universe. Anthony God believed that the mathematical forms were a correct method with which to measure and scale the divine. He states, a tetrahedron with unlimited faces is the synthesis of infinite space. The first of these surfaces could symbolize the Trinity, while the second represents light, the third movement. The paraboloid is generated by a straight line that slides along the two others. If we imagine the three straight lines to be infinite, the first can symbolize the Holy Ghost, that is the union between the Father and the Son, represented by the other two straight lines. The infinite three form of totality, which is one, indivisible, and infinite. Qualities which coincide with the essence of the Holy Trinity. And this guy was really religious, so he was using architecture and how it represented the Holy Trinity. And one of the best examples of architecture as magic is the idea of the temple, right? Where the temple becomes this place where essentially it's theurgy, where you're trying to tap into higher entities in order to invoke a change in the material world, where you're using theurgy to invoke a change. And me coming from a Pentecostal standpoint, I think I understand that very well. When there are people running around and speaking in tongues and doing all these crazy things within the church because of, and this is what we're going to get into in the second hour, about the effect of ritual and how all these things affect the psyche and all these things. And it was widely accepted in ancient times that the cube, it all goes back to the cube, was the source of all form and number. And Martinus a Capella wrote, the God is adored in all temples with cubic solidity. The cube, which is weird, right? Because we relate that to Saturn and all these other things, right? The cube, the Saturn time cube and all these things. And we have the cube in Mecca. We have the cube in the Twin Towers. We have the Tesseract, which is a cube, Hellraiser, the cube. It all goes back to the cube. The cube having 6 faces, 8 vertices, and 12 edges represents the harmonic ratio 6, 8, 12, and was called the geometric harmony, and was revered by the Pythagoreans as the perfect figure. Now, what I was able to capture from all the things that I was reading, because you touched on something very important in all of this, the Pythagorean palace thing. And it's the last step. It's the corpo transparente, which is the 3D form, what they use, with the final form of the thought. But essentially, the path it takes is the cube, which is the father of all numbers, of all shapes, of everything mathematical. The cube in the tetragrammaton, which is the spoken word, Yahweh, right? The 4 different names of God. The cube folds out into a cross, which represents materiality. Jesus was crucified on the cross. We have the formation, also representative of the demiurge. So you could say that's why he's the father of all things. The cube is the father of all things, because formation is the demiurge's number. Okay. And the number 4 is you have the 4 directions. You have the 4 elements. You have a bunch of different things associated with the 4. And the Pythagoreans revered as the perfect figure. So it goes from the cube to number forms, which we're going to get into next, or what I call numbers form, because they form reality. You have the cube, number forms, the perfect figure, which is man. Linea occulte, which is these occulted lines on the drawing or the schematics of the building, and then the corpo transparente, which is exactly worded the way that you said, this imaginary scaffolding. If the initiate who has been trained is able to see it, you have the corpo transparente, which is this imaginary scaffolding, or what I consider the real Google backrooms, not just some glitch in the matrix. No, it's an actual place. It's right. Galton's Gulch or whatever it was called in Atlas Shrugged, with this place.
Gulch, yeah.
Yeah, whatever it's called, where they go and it's behind, or you can't find it unless you are initiated,
right,
in order to know where to find it. So I wanted out here in 1926, Mystery of the Cathedrals. Fulcanelli claims that the Gothic cathedrals were hermetic libraries in stone with the secret alchemy displayed for all who could understand to read. And I just want to, I have notes that didn't make it into the main thing, but I just want to touch that because essentially that's what it is. It's this picture book on, and they would put the secrets, almost like a revelation of the method of revelation, or revelational method, where they put it out there, but you only understand it if you can read it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's still there. They completed their ritual, whatever it was.
Right.
Let's put it out here for whoever can read. The initiated understand what this is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's the end of the first section.
Okay. Quickly, I want to just say, when you were talking about the cube, the father, right? Like that, you know, so one of the buildings that I have focused on quite a bit here in Austin is called the Independent, right? And inside this cage up top here, there is a black cube. I don't know if you can see it in that picture.
I can, yeah.
Right? So there is a cube that has a fence around it, and you can see they'll light the fence up, right? And with colors and whatnot, but inside there's the cube. Let me just see if there's a picture that has like a little bit better angle on it so we can see, but yeah.
Where is that?
That's in Austin. This is a building. This is the building that really started to get me thinking, right? And it is, it's on the area that I call my portal in Austin, right? Which at this point I'm sharing with lots of other people that have figured out what's going on over there. Here's a picture of, so like, this is the building here, right? And then there is something right here. And a lot of these buildings want to be right looking into this, right?
There's an arch there. There's a gateway there. That's a gate. You can consider that a gateway.
Bridge. There's owls here. And there's a new, from whenever this picture was taken, there's a new building here in front of that now. So this is an old picture of that area. But this is Shoal Creek back here. And this is a really interesting place energetically. There's a power plant right here. There is a building called the Proper that I've been told Elon Musk owns the penthouse of. And there's a new building here that looks kind of like a capsized ship. But at night, but depending on how you observe it, acts as a Pythagorean palace. It projects many possibilities, including the Giza Plateau, and a variety of other things. Depending on what angle you look at the building from, you were thinking it's doing something different than it's doing.
Perception.
And you can't see that in this picture, right?
And is that along the 33rd parallel?
I don't know. I don't know. I've not looked at the parallels. I've not looked at that in relation to, but I should. So. Yeah. Anywho, okay, let's real quick, let's just have okay, so it is almost 6:30. I've been working all day, and my better, more beautiful half is going to be home in a little bit and eventually going to want dinner. So I think we're going to probably have to split this into 2 shows. So should we move into the second hour, and you can do part 2 there, and then we can make a part 3 that is just for patrons as well. How do you want to do this? I can probably go for another hour right now. So what do you think we should do?
The next section is not that long, depending on how much we talk.
Okay.
We can finish up the next section, number forms, end it, and then we can get to the 3rd section and see how long we get.
Okay. All right, go for it. I'll try to hold my tongue unless there's just something that has to be said.
That's the problem with these things, because it can go anywhere. But yeah. The next section is number forms. And in traditional mathematics, a number form is a mental map of numbers, which automatically and involuntarily appear whenever someone who experiences number forms, because not everybody does, right? Which is weird. It's a phenomenon. whenever somebody who experiences number forms thinks of numbers, the numbers are mapped into distinct spatial patterns, and the mappings may vary in individuals. So it's a phenomenon, which on the third section, we get into phenomenology, which is a new term I came across when I was studying this. So it was first documented by Sir Francis Galton, right? And I mentioned what was it? The Galton Gulch or whatever it was in Atlas Shrugged. I forgot the name of it.
Gulch. Okay, Galton Gulch.
Galt.
I gotcha. Okay. Gulch
Weird.
was like some libertarian like community project in South America that I assumed was named after Galt from, Iran or whatnot. So, okay, Galton is something different. Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. So the Sir Francis Galton, which was an English Victorian era polymath, and this term was used in his works, The Visions of a Sane Person. And this guy, I haven't looked more into him, but just briefly, he had a really interesting background. I just want to say that he is the cousin to Darwin, I think his name's Charles Darwin, the evolution theory guy. He's family to him. So he was knighted and all this stuff. So he's really weird. Later research identified them as types of synesthesia. And synesthesia, which meaning the union of the senses, is a perceptual phenomenon in which simulation of one sensory or cognitive pathway leads to involuntary experiences in a second sensory or cognitive pathway. So when you think of the number one and it's green or blue or something, that's what that is. And then I put on here, why is the matrix code green? So they're getting at this thing, you know what I mean? We're seeing where they're getting their influences from. And one common form of this is known as grapheme color synesthesia, where the individual associates numbers and letters with color experiences, how I just mentioned. And again, just like number forms, it is involuntary. And the semantic vacuum hypothesis predicts the reason for why this may happen is because it's the first thing that we're taught in an educational environment as a child, right? This is the first thing that we're taught, like, look at the number one, that's blue, a 1, 2, and you know, the letters and all these things. So that's why they say we experience that. But I think I think it goes much deeper than that. And defining synesthesia is difficult because of the terminology. So then there's another term, and accurate but less used term, how they put it, ideesthesia. Ideesthesia.
Okay.
Again, there's a lot of thesias here. So
excited for this one. Let's hear this one.
Ideesthesia is a neuropsychological phenomenon in which activations of concepts evoke perception-like sensory experiences. And it's essentially like synesthesia, but the difference is how it's triggered, right? Okay. And I'm not going to get into the specifics because it's very convoluted, but essentially one of them considers the trigger and the outcome as a sensory hallucination, is what it is. And then the other one doesn't. It's like, oh, well, there's only one trigger. That's what differs to both. But then there's another term, aphantasia, which is the inability to voluntarily create a mental image in your mind. So we have the two spectrums of people, the people who can tap into this other what I would consider other dimension, and you have the people who they can't. There's just no way. There's people who don't have an inner monologue. There's people who don't hear their thoughts in their heads. And that gets into the whole NPC thing, which I did a whole episode on that. You can check it out on my show, of people of what makes an NPC. And so I said, okay, so maybe they understand that some people can be initiated into this versus the people who can't be initiated into it. There's a two groups of people. And this is an excerpt from the book that I want to talk about in the Patreon section. This is an excerpt of it by a really weird guy, and I'll get into the lore of the book and how I got the book in the second, in the behind the paywall, because again, I'm kind of in the gray area of what I should say from it and what I shouldn't, because it's really weird. It's not available really anywhere, and I was able to get a copy. So he states this. This is just what human thought is doing all the time. The human mind builds architectural forms dependent on and determined by the nature of thought. Man is an architect in the invisible as well as the visible world. He builds with his mind in the super substance of thought subconsciously, as well as consciously in stone. No doubt his visible architect is a replica of the invisible thought forms, which he is all the time building in his aura and objectifying for clairvoyance to observe. When he erects a building in stone and ornaments it, he is simply objectifying the state of his own mind and emotions and those of the community or period in which he lives. Styles of architecture thus reproduce community outlook. And that is from that. So that's deep, right? So when I came across, I was like, oh man, that's crazy. And the way I came across this book, I was like, So this all sprung from the first book, Pythagorean Palaces. If you're able to get one, it's pretty rare now, I guess. So then we get into Marsilio Ficino, the guy that I mentioned at the beginning. He compared the architects as demiurges, the buildings as homunculus, magical talismans that they were using back then. And this plays a role in the juice of this entire presentation is in the third half, because that's when I really let loose and everything comes together. So Marsilio Ficino's number forms come from an interpretation of Plato's numbers. So Plato had this thing in the Republic where nobody knew what he meant by it. And there is literally no interpretation of it other than what people make of it. And Ficino was a Neoplatonic scholar. He was studying Plato's works, and he wrote a commentary about it. So numbers, according to Ficino, could thrive and create their own children, families, tribes, armies, and populations. They could copulate. So when 3 copulates with 4, the 4 being female, and he has a whole cosmology of what makes a number male or female, it produces 12. So 3 times 4 produces 12. And that is a Pythagorean thought that numbers, they build on top of each other. So the story of the dragon and the sword and the knight, right? The knight slaying the dragon, the sword is the monad. The knight is you could consider him the 3. So you have this idea of a demiurge, so 3 + 1, right? They build a story based on numbers. And I get into that in the Pythagorean number symbolism because it gets very convoluted and I cover everything, but essentially numbers could reproduce. A number can also copulate with itself. Thus, 27 is the cube of 3. So it goes back to the cubic form at the end of the day. And I also got from this, the cube is best imprinted in the mind. So there's a reason, this goes beyond architecture. There's a reason why at the casino, the reason dice are the way they are is not because they work the best in that shape, perhaps, but because they're implemented in your mind the best. Mm-hmm. That's why it's a cube. A dice is a cube. And that is, you could associate that cube to the downfall of a lot of people with gambling addictions and all these things, right? So you take that for what you will. So 27 is the cube of 3, and it is therefore its own mother, father, grandmother, and grandfather on both sides. And this is a Pythagorean concept known as figured numbers. In Ficino's version of figured numbers, they are given a lot more power since every number corresponds with a geometric form. A form does and is everything that a number does and is. And man is thus a creator and architect on a small scale as God is the great architecture of the universe. Man, in the image of God, mentally creates forms which duplicate the greater force forms of the universe at large. And I believe that's also from the book that we will be referencing in the second half. And I want to just point out the basic Pythagorean hierarchy of number and form. You have the number 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 1 corresponds with a point. Number 2 corresponds with a line. Number 3 corresponds with a plane. And then the number 4, which is the procreator of everything, corresponds with a solid. So it all goes back to the cube. And I get into a lot more detail in the second half, the final part where I tie everything together and we really let the sparks fly, because that's where the juice is at.
All right. So a couple things, just a few remarks on this, and then we'll take a quick break and move on over. When you were saying that like the numbers have relationships with each other and copulate and have relationships and whatever, like I literally remember Sesame Street doing that concept when I was a kid. Like, they were, I can't remember what it was one of the episodes, and it was something about, 3 did something to 4 or something like that. But it was basically a very, they do this, right? They put it right there in front of your face, but they don't, go all the way with it. It's not an idea. It's thought of as a childish idea that, 3 was afraid of 4, or 3 ate 4, or 3 did this to 4, or whatever it was,
7,
right?
8, 9, yeah.
9, right? All of this kind of thing. Yeah, right. But there was the whole, I remember like Grover and all, whatever the characters were. So it's there, but most people, if their mind went there as an adult, they'd be like, oh, that's just some silly shit I saw on Sesame Street. And they wouldn't pursue it. Like, they wouldn't be like, I'm going to do a doctorate on this or something like that. Right. So that's interesting. What you said about the architecture you said something about the community, like how it generates the community's thought form or the theme for the communities or whatever. This was, so when I had like the main download from my cousin, William Cressell, and people can look him up. He was a mid-century modern architect, worked lots of places, but mostly in Palm Springs and other areas of Southern California, and is credited with a style of roof called the butterfly roof. That is pretty common in mid-century modern architecture from that point forward. There's a street named after him there. Some of his houses are really cool. But one of the things he explained to me about what they were doing with mid-century modern architecture was creating, it's not very ornate, like some of the older Victorian or Tartarian or Tudor kind of stuff, right? It's very simple angles and materials and whatnot. The idea being that this was a good design for a creative person, a deep thinker, to unload the thought, the contents of their mind onto the space around them, and then look at them from sort of different angles, different perspectives, with a little light in. What did it look like on a synthetic surface? What did it look like on natural slate, stone, wood, or whatever? Compare the two, and that this could evolve over time. These other structures that were ornate had an imposed idea that when you saw that, you would think this. But what this was like a way of examining something that as your mind changed, because think about when mid-century modern came, it was in the 40s, 50s, 60s. This was a revolution. This was a time where we were going from into the technological age, right? Moving from like pre-war to post-war. This was architecture like that was supportive of the idea that people should open their mind, that they should change their mind, that things could evolve over time, not that things should stay the way that they always were. So it's interesting with what you said. And the fact is that a lot of these communities, the entire neighborhood and whatnot, would be this style of architecture. And here you had people who were part of movements to like move society in a certain direction. One can debate whether that was a good direction or not, but it does exactly the thing that you were saying happens in a community. And that was part of his communication to me. Remember that whole download? Like, it was fucking weird. We're laying in the backyard, looking up at the sky. I have my eyes closed, and I went on like this 20-minute thing. She was like, shit, I should have recorded that. That was fucking phenomenal, right? But that's what it was. And then the last thing is, of course, you said 27. 27 was the number you picked to talk about. And we have the 27 Club. So I'm so curious about the sort of number, character, formula of these people who are thought of as being part of the 27 Club, and like what they're made of, right? Kind of thing. So that's pretty interesting. And Michael and I did a whole show on 27. And at the end of the show, like, we had the fascinating realization that like the area that we were sort of talking about in relationship to it was right along highway number 27, right? So there's always that, right? All right, let's do this. Let's take a quick break. We're going to move over into the supporter section. If you want to join us for that, you can go to patreon.com/offplanetmedia, emilymoyer.locals.com, or rockfin.com/Emily Moyer. And Juan is going to give us the juice. And this has already been pretty juicy, but I guess like we're going to get like the real inner nectar there. But
hopefully I don't disappoint.
This has now not been disappointing at all. Where can people find your work, your podcast, all the things you do?
The Juan on Juan podcast on all social media platforms, the juanonjuanpodcast.com. And you can find all my links on there. I have a Patreon, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, all that good stuff. And yeah, you can find me on there. And I also want to plug, I'm going to be doing a monthly, I guess a zine or a journal or something, the Occultist Monday, The Hidden World. And it's a project I'm getting together with some people. I would love if you would write an article for us. And it's just a journal of various esoteric and weird topics. I wrote about the homunculus, the alchemical homunculus, and I go on a whole spiel about that. It's history of Aristotelian biology and a whole bunch of stuff. This is a prototype, but we're working on the final product now, so you can find that on my website as well. And I just got copies of a comic book that I was working on, and it's going to be an ongoing series. But issue number 1, Strange Juans versus the Saturnian Cube. Well, we're talking about the cube today, but that's a topic I've always been obsessed with. You can find that on my website as well if you want to get a copy of it. And the next issue has Sam Tripoli in it. We have Gordo from Those Conspiracy Guys. We have Isaac Weishaupt. We have Mark from My Family Thinks I'm Crazy. We have a whole bunch of people in the community who are going to be a part of it, and it's going to be really juicy. So it's like it's almost like a Rick and Morty type of thing, but with our spin on it, right? It's going to be a weird conspiracy-based comic book, and you can that's in collaboration with Paranoid American Comics. So yeah, you can find that on my website as well, the101podcast.com.
Awesome. I will link all your stuff down below, and I'm sure we'll have you back here again. But right now, we're moving over to the other side. See you there, guys.